let's make a start, shall we? Welcome to Getting Started with Workflow in .NET 4. My name is Steph Sewell. I'm an architect working here in Auckland for a company called Adirant. Joined on stage by Pete Goodman. He's one of our lead engineers. We were TAP members, so we had early access to the .NET 4 framework, both for VS 2010, .NET 4, and at Fabric. So we've been working with .NET 4 for the last 18 months. And the last 9 months has seen us migrate our embedded Workflow 3 solution over to Workflow 4. So we've been very hands-on with Workflow 4 for a little while now. And we want to basically spend this session just really scratching the surface of Workflow 4 and giving you guys enough information to get started with it, start being productive with it. But at the same time, there's an awful lot of stuff to kind of absorb and take on. So we've included a lot of additional resources in the slides, so you can find out more stuff later on. Okay. So first of all, we want to make sure that this session is appropriate for you. So runtime mediated code rendezvous. Is there anyone in the audience who has a clue what I'm talking about? No volunteers? That's probably good. Because if you knew what I was talking about, this isn't a session for you. This is a 200 level session, and so by the end of the session I actually might be able to explain to you what that statement means, but I will tell you where you can go out and find what that statement means. So let's jump on. Okay, so the agenda splits into two for this next hour. We're going to cover off two major topics, the first of which is workflow basics. And really I just want to answer these questions for you. So we're going to talk about what is a workflow, why would I use a workflow? And having got through that, we're then going to jump into demos. Best way to show you workflow is to demo it, to build some stuff as workflows. And having got through that and got you through the basics, we'll then give you that list of resources which tells you where to go next. Following on from workflow basics, we're going to talk about one of the key new Workflow 4 features, which is workflow services. So we're going to talk about what a workflow service is, why you might choose to write your workflows as services, services as workflows, and again we'll do the how. So we'll go into a bunch of demos to show you how to create, how to host, how to monitor and manage your workflow services. Having got through all that, again, there's a lot more information, and so we'll give you resources to kind of pick up and follow on. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. What is a workflow? So I kind of went off to Wikipedia looking for a definition, and all it has was a workflow consists of a sequence of connected steps. And that was kind of like, oh, okay, well, that could equally apply to staircase. So the best way to kind of introduce a workflow is actually to show you one. And first thing to take away from this slide is that a workflow is visual. So a workflow is a diagram representing a sequence of connected steps. We've got two different sorts of workflow up on screen just now. On my left there is a flow chart, and then we also have a state machine. So just having a look at that flow chart, we can see that we start off in the top left, we perform a number of steps, we come to a decision. Based on a decision that we make, we can go left and right, so we have branching constructs. Now I know you won't be able to read what those steps are very easily, but they're basically steps that are describing what's happening in the language of the problem space. So workflows are quite high-level concepts, where the workflow is defined in terms of the problem space rather than as a technology solution. For a state machine, we have a number of states. There's arrows indicating what the valid transitions are. And we would also have events in there saying what could trigger those valid transitions. Now, this will come as no surprise to any of you, I'm sure, but it gives us a starting point. So you guys are all software engineers or in the software engineering space, so a workflow is a program. It's a sequence of steps that allows us to achieve some sort of outcome. So we're going to add one word to this statement to hopefully refine this, and that one word is declarative. So a workflow is a declarative program. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's really kind of two styles of programming that you probably do in your day-to-day. There's when you're writing programs and you're writing explicitly the how to do a process, how to achieve something. So you construct a bunch of classes, call a bunch of methods. You're doing a lot of kind of low-level, this is exactly what the steps are, I want you to achieve our goal. There's another style, and that's really kind of your .NET programming. There's another style of programming that we do very often, which is when we write queries. So if we're writing LINQ statements or we're writing SQL, what we provide is a specification of what we want, not how to achieve it. We take our specification of what we want, where we want it from, how we want it ordered, how we want it filtered, and we pass that off to a query engine. So there's this intermediary that we hand off the query to, and it goes and figures out the how for us. And so workflows fit into that latter category. So with a workflow, there is a runtime. And the workflow runtime is responsible for scheduling the execution of these steps. So when we define a workflow, we define it visually. So we're taking these steps and arranging them. We're then taking that specification, handing it off to a runtime, and asking that runtime to execute it for us. And as well as doing the scheduling, the runtime is also extensible. So the runtime is emitting events to say what steps are being executed and what process, what kind of stage we're at during that execution, which allows services and additional features to be kind of plugged into that runtime. And Microsoft gives us a couple of these kind of plug-in services for runtime, which makes it much more powerful. So one of them is tracking. So we have this idea of being able to track how far through a program's execution we are by listening to the events that are coming out. And the runtime has a number of properties which allow us to kind of serialize the state of the program in flight. So a workflow program is stackless. It's also thread, process, and machine agile. Now, we'll see later on why that's really important when it comes to recoverability and scale out. But you're not working in your kind of traditional CLR model here. You're not working with a stack. You're working with a workflow runtime, and it's a very simple programming model, but very powerful. Okay, so workflow is composed of an ordered sequence of activities. So the steps that we're talking about, the formal name for that is an activity. And when we say that they're composed, we're basically saying that a workflow is built out of activities. And the way that we build a workflow, as we'll see in the demo, it is actually a visual experience. It's almost like Lego blocks. It's pulling things out of a palette, arranging them on a canvas, connecting them together. So the experience of creating a workflow is very similar to what a business analyst would be used to when they're working with Visio or a similar design tool. Okay. So the activity is this composable unit, and it's really the atom in the workflow universe. So everything in a workflow is actually built up from activities. And activities can either be units of work, so certain activities are, do make a web call and wait for that to come back, do a piece of computation. But the activity can be more than that. It can also control flow. So you can actually construct your own flow control statements to do quite complex pieces, such as escalation is one that we do. So you have an activity which sits and waits for its inner activity to be completed. If it doesn't get completed in a certain amount of time, you can actually cancel that activity and go and do something else instead. So in this way, you can kind of escalate and say, well, you've got a certain amount of time to do this operation. If you don't do it in that amount of time, I want you to go off and do something else. And we compose by dragging on that escalation activity and dropping in to the body whatever we want done, and then we can also set up the alternate path. And that kind of hints at one of the extension models for workflow. Out of the box, Microsoft ships a whole bunch of activities that you can build your programs from, but these are quite low level. In some ways, they're quite primitive. But there's an entire model behind that that allows you to go and build your own activities. So there's a customization point there where you can actually look at the domain that you're working in and build a bunch of activities that map to concepts in that domain. So far we've kind of been talking about the behavior within the program, but of course programs we also need state. And the way that we capture state within a workflow is through variables. And these are just .NET types. So they may be strings, they may be ints, booleans, but equally they could be complex object graphs. It could be an order with a whole bunch of order lines. It could be a customer with their addresses. Anything that you can model, you can actually work with that through workflow. Okay, so we have workflow, it has behavior, it has state. We have an activity. So we want to get that data that's part of our workflow, pass it off to an activity, have the activity work on it, and then return us a result. And the way that we do that is via this concept called arguments. So we have in arguments, we have out arguments. So it allows us to flow a variable into an activity, have that activity work on it, and flow us back something in return. And the in and out arguments basically form the method signature or the public contract, if you like, for your activity. So the activity is a unit of work in its own right that you link together to perform a larger piece of work. So that's really the very basic concepts of workflow. Workflow is nothing more than a bunch of activities linked together. We have some data captures as variables, flows through the activities via the arguments, and once we have that specification for the program, we hand it off to the runtime, and the runtime executes it for us. So why would I use a workflow? Well, the best answer we can give is because what you're trying to model actually fits a workflow. So often we have business processes that are either written down in Visio diagrams or are recorded on paper, and what we want to be able to do is take those and actually automate them, give them to a machine and have a machine control the coordination of those processes. And that's one reason for using a workflow. Another reason for using a workflow is that it's very good at coordinating asynchronous work. So this idea of an asynchronous activity where you can drop a bunch of them in parallel and actually have the runtime engine look after the scheduling of that work and the coordination of that work. And if you try and do that in raw code in C# or in VB.NET, you can spend a lot of time on that thread synchronization on those background workers, whereas if you write it as a workflow, it's actually a much, much simpler programming model. Now, along with this idea of kind of capturing business processes, they tend to be much longer running than the service operations that we traditionally write in something like C# and then host them as WCF services. So these are business operations that may be running for minutes, for weeks, for hours, for days, and we need some way of capturing that state and persisting it to disk and then being able to bring it back. We want some way of, if there's a pause in the execution of that process, that we can release resources and come back and continue when we want to. So this is this idea of episodic work. So I mean, a good example is anything to do with human-based workflow. Send a task out to someone saying, please review this document for me. They review it, it maybe take them 1 or 2 hours, they have comments. For those 2 hours that the person is reviewing that document, the process that's controlling the overall flow of work doesn't need to be in memory, it doesn't need to be in a server, because it's just idle time, it's just waiting. And so there is this ability to take the running state of a workflow and serialize it down to disk, unload it from memory, and then bring it back into memory when it's needed. And so if you have long-running processes, then workflow is a good way of trying to capture those. Now, this is also one of the things that we do. Because you can build your own libraries of activities, you can build your own Lego blocks, if you like, of how to build out your solutions. So you have this two-tiered approach to developing with workflow. You have this high-level abstract notion of effectively drawing your program by dragging these activities onto a surface, connecting them together. But at the same time, you have the ability to define what those Lego bricks are. And so you can construct your own bricks, your own activities, and in doing so, you can almost build your own kind of visual DSL type experience where, as an ISV, we build an activity library for doing a lot of kind of tasks within a law firm. So one example is the file intake process. And so there's due diligence and there's checking that has to go on when a law firm wants to bring on new business. They have to make sure that it's not in conflict with any other business that they're doing. They want to make sure that it's profitable, of course. There's a whole bunch of checks that go on. So we have an activity library that allows them to build out that process, because that process is unique to them and it's also subject to change. So you want to have a lightweight, easy to use way of programming that process. And so we take care of the hard lifting, if you like, of doing the name reconciliation and a whole bunch of other things. And they control the actual flow around, they control their business process. And in that way, you can actually provide this intuitive customization model, because the workflow designer is rehostable, so you can embed that into your own applications. And these activities, you can write your own WPF presentation for the activity. So when it appears on the design surface, you can actually make it do some really quite interesting things. And again, you can take that visual experience, and if there's an experience that they're used to, you can map that into your software. So how do I create a workflow? And for this, I'm going to kick over to Pete, and we're going to actually demo this stuff.
All right. Now, I have to do this in 1024, so this could be kind of interesting. What you're looking at, of course, is Visual Studio 2010. The kind of workflow environment that we've got here has been a little bit customized for our scenario. So this is an example of a sample that we ship with our product. It's a leave request. So the scenario is that somebody's requesting for some leave. They fill out some details. Those details get approved, so they've got to go through an approval process. Typically, there'll be a department head and a supervisor, and then we kind of make some decisions based on that. So let's kind of walk through this. The activities on the left-hand side that you see in the toolbox, most of the ones that are visible to you at the moment are out of the box. We've got our own ones that we provided down here under Expert, which is the name of our product. Most of the ones we've got on the surface here are going to be the custom ones. So we start off, and this is a flow chart. So you can in Workflow 4, they introduced the concept of a flow chart model. So this is kind of like you would do in a whiteboard. If you're going to whiteboard your process, what most people come up with. So there's a big improvement already over the previous in 3.5. So we're going to set up some business sensitive information. So we kind of have this reference activity that kind of just sets some context for this instance. So when we're looking through a list of instances, we can kind of know what relationship this process has. We've introduced our own concept of a manual task. This one is the initial leave request form. So we have our own client software. Sits down in the corner here. And whenever we create a manual task, we put a manual task activity on Workflow. It's going to send out a task to that user. It's going to pop up in their client, and then they can fill out some details and then complete. Next thing we do, we go and get a list of approvers, and we go through the approval process. So you'll see here some of this parallel execution we're talking about. So you'll see that we have a supervisor approval and we have a department head approval. So those two tasks are going to go out to those people. They have to complete them and return them, and then we'll continue on with the workflow process. So all the way through here, as we've been doing these activities, we've been passing arguments into our activities, and we're using variables that kind of get the results of those out arguments from those activities and actually keep them in the state of our workflow. So you can see a list of variables there, and the variables and arguments are all accessible down here. Now we have a decision. So a flowchart comes with these decision points. And there's a decision condition in here. And this is in VB script. So in Workflow 4, whenever you set arguments on an activity, you do it in VB expressions. Currently, there's only VB, right? So what are we saying here? We're saying that if the department head approves and the supervisor approves, then we're going to go down the happy path, which is down the approved path. And we're going to approve those requested leave. So we advised payroll, they've got to update their system, and we send out an email to the original requester saying, look, your leave request has been approved. all good. But if things aren't great, sorry about the resolution, we go down to the decline path. We update some details basically, and we go through the same process. So our typical kind of sample process that we ship with our product. So let's run it up and see what happens. So we have our own custom runner. This isn't kind of out of the box. We've kind of provided our own custom development environment for this.
So the reason we're showing you this to start off with is we want to kind of show you that high level, how you can actually capture meaningful business processes in workflow. Now to do this whole human-based interaction, we've had to write some additional code, and shortly we'll show you how you write those activities. But the idea here is you can see that that workflow process, that leave request process, actually maps directly to software. And it maps directly into the shape of a process that you would kind of normally see in Visio.
All right, so this again is our own custom UI. So this is our kind of manual task system. I'm just going to say, look, it's vacation, it's well today, see ya, and complete. So we'll do that leave request form. It's going to get a list of approvers. Then we'll go through the approval process for the supervisor and department head. Now I've wired these to come to myself. All right. So this guy, supervisor, is going to complete, approve. Second guy, he's going to decline basically because he doesn't like you. Sweet. Going to complete. Now, if we go back to our workflow and have a look at what we expect to happen here, we're going to hit that decision. It's going to be evaluated. It's going to be evaluated. We're going to go back through this process, right? So we're going to go back, all the way back up. We're going to ask for more information, saying, look, the guy obviously doesn't like you. You're going to have to fill out some more information. So go back to the requester. Additional information. Look, I don't like you either. Complete that. So now we should be on the approvals, rather. So we're going back down through the approval. We changed the process. And these guys are just going to have to sign off on this. All right, this guy is just, completes. He completes. Now, in here you'll see that we've sent an email and we've advised payroll. So this is my payroll task coming up. Complete that. And you can see that I've got the email saying that my leave request has been approved. So this is kind of cool. It shows you how you can get manual tasks and this kind of interaction. Now to write this in code, it's actually a bit of a pain, right? If you're going to write all the services that do all this and do all the coordination, it is actually a bit of a pain. And it's not very easy for people to see what's going on, right? Or you have to model it in some other tool, and the two of them become disparate. We've actually modeled it in a way that a BA would, and the BA may have actually done this, and we've just executed that model, right?
So by BA we mean business analyst, just in case.
Yep. All right.
So just actually, do you want to drag some activities on there and wire them up and just show them how easy it is to do this?
So as I said, this is kind of composable. So if you wanted to do something really useful, like write out to the console, you could do that, and you could drag it on and basically just compose up, and then we can start to kind of, from here, go somewhere else and start to make decisions. So it's basically just wiring these things up. In the flowchart case, it's a case of wiring these up with these lines and boxes.
Cool.
All right, so that's kind of a highly customized scenario. But how do we actually create one of these things from scratch? So let's go through it. So we're not going to use any of our custom product. We're going to go through with a new project. 2010, you'll see you've got a workflow section. Under here, I'm going to choose a workflow console app. I'm not going to go into the other options just now. What we're going to do, we're going to build a console application where you ask it a question. It's like a magic 8-ball. You ask it a question, you shake it, and it gives you some kind of random useful answer. And then we're just going to display that on the screen. So I've got a workflow console application. Called it 8-ball console app. I've cancelled, which is really good. Let's go back. 8-ball console. So what does this template give us out of the box? Spinning donut.
Geez, you can tell we're in a demo, can't you?
See what I'll do? I'll minimize it and then restore it, and it'll count it caught up. No? Drag squares on the desktop?
Does it want a network connection or something?
No. Okay. So don't worry about the black area. you want the white bit on the side there. All right. So it's opened up a blank workflow for us. So let's look at what's in this project. So on here we've got workflow1.xaml. So declarative workflows, the workflows that you draw, are written in XAML. So it's a flavor of XML. It's the same one that's used by WPF. It's overlaid, etc. So we've got a XAML document, which is our workflow, which has been opened for us. Awesome. And when that's finished loading, we've also got a program.cs because it's a console app. All right, let's open that up. All right, what is this thing doing? It basically calls workflow invoker.invoke new workflow 1. The workflow invoker basically a class that says if you give me an activity like this workflow is, so a workflow is an activity and activity is workflow, so they're, as we said, they're composable. If you give it an activity and you say invoke, it's going to call the workflow runtime, which will start a new instance of that workflow or activity, and it will block until it's finished. All right. So this is kind of useful in these scenarios. We just want to run it and just call me back when you're done, or actually just block until you're done.
So this is as if you're just making a method call, but instead of calling a class method, you're basically calling a workflow. Now something else I just want to point out. You can see that we're using types from system.activities. When you have a look, you'll also see there's a system.workflows namespace. Don't go in there. That's old stuff. That's workflow 3. If you find yourself consuming types from system.workflow, you're using the wrong workflow model. So I'll just throw that in there to save yourself a little bit of pain, maybe.
Yep. Been there. All right. So let's go back to our workflow process. Look at this magic 8-ball. We're going to ask it a question. It's going to give us an answer. Now, we did a flow chart before, but we can easily just do a sequence. So I'm going to create a sequence. Now, the sequence basically says drop some activities in me, and I'm going to execute them in a sequential order. That's it. It's not like a flow chart where you're going to branch, etc. It's just going to execute them in sequence. I'm going to need an argument for my workflow. I'm going to take in a question. We have type string. I'm also going to have a variable to store the answer that I'm going to generate. Okay. Now I need to do some stuff. That's all very good. I've done some coordination for basically nothing. Now I need to actually do some stuff. So to do that, I'm going to create a custom activity. Now, there are item templates for this. I'm just going to do it from scratch, just to show you how it's kind of put together. 8-ball. Caps lock, 8-ball. All right, now I'm using ReSharper here, so it just kind of expedites things a little bit. If you're not using ReSharper, check it out. It's actually pretty good. But it just makes it easier to kind of complete a couple of things that we're going to do. All right, so I'm going to make a code activity. To do that, I just use a base class code activity. Yep, import that namespace. Thank you very much. Now you have to override the execute method. Hopefully you can see this. If not, tough. We're on 1024. Live with it. All right. So the execute is basically the stuff we're going to do. That's where you're going to do that stuff, right? Now I'm going to need to pass a question in here. So there's a question that's come into my workflow. I need to pass that off to my custom activity. We said we pass data into activities using arguments. So I can just define an argument on here of type string and call it question. All right, let me just scroll across here. Now, hold on. What's with this in argument thing in this code activity context? Basically, when you use that workflow, if you look back at this invoker code, I could new up that workflow 1 and I could just invoke it multiple times, right? So you can use the same definition and start kicking off like multiple instances of a workflow. So a single instance of my 8-ball class is going to be used by multiple instances of my workflow. Therefore, if this was a normal property, if I just done public string question, that's going to be the same and shared amongst all those instances. So that's not a great idea. I need some way to get into the context of that instance. I need to get the data for that instance. To do that, you tie up in arguments with the activity context.
And this context is owned by the runtime. So at this point, the execute method is the thing that the runtime is going to actually go to say, right, do whatever you have to do. And it's going to pass us this activity context, which gives us the state of that running workflow and allows us to interact with it.
So I'm going to generate a not-so-random answer. So to do that, I need to get the value of my question. And I said we ask context for it. You can tell the question, you can tell the argument to ask the context for it using question.getContext. All right, I'm going to actually take the length. And now I have a predefined list of responses in here. So just a bunch of random responses. Anybody that knows Father Ted knows the middle one. So to get the answer that I want, I'm just going to mod answers.length. So this isn't really a random generator, you'll notice. And I'll just index into that collection. Just scroll out a little bit. All right. Now I can go and create my out argument. You'll see that we have an in argument, which is question. I can create an equivalent out argument for the result. There's a shorthand for doing this. If you make a code activity of T, you will get a automatic result out argument created for you. So there you can see that by making it a code activity of T, the base class already has a result of T. So this is kind of handy, which you don't have to keep assigning things back to the result out argument through the context. You can do it because it changes the signature of your execute method for string. You just turn, answer. All right. So we've got our not-so-random answer. Let's go and use this. So I'll bring back my toolbox. So to get the custom activity we've just written to appear in the toolbox, you just rebuild the project. You should see it pop up in the top left corner there. Now I can drag this on. All right. I've got my 8-ball activity. You'll see we had actually customized our activity designers. You can do that in WPF. We're not going to go into it today. But it's relatively simple. There's a lot of documentation out there on how to do it. So you can see I've got a question and a result down the properties panel here. For the question, I've already created an argument for my workflow. I'm going to just pass the argument for my workflow to the argument activity. We'll use a VB expression for that. And question. I mean, you could do string concat and all sorts of stuff in here. That's the power of VB being right there. You don't have to use variables to store, like, stuff that you're just going to use once. The result is going to go into the answer variable that I created. The last thing I want to do is write that out to the console. Okay, so I've created a workflow, created a custom activity. That custom activity takes in the question from my workflow, generates a random answer, which assigns the workflow assigns back to a variable, and then writes that out to the console. So let's run this up. Awesome. Alrighty-o. So, yeah, looks good. Right, what's going wrong?
You never provided a question.
Oh, I didn't provide a question. No, I did this multiple times when I was trying this out. And it seems I don't learn from my mistakes. So, if we go to the program, you see that we haven't written a question yet. Well done. So I've got to read that in from the console. Simple enough. I'll just do a console.writeLine. Ask question. Now, console read line. Now I need to pass that into this invoker. The invoker, that invoke method has an overload which takes a dictionary of string object. So you basically just initialize this thing saying, look, I'm going to give you the name of the argument I want to pass it to and the value that I want to go in there. Cool. So now I'm invoking it, I'm passing an argument through to it. It's going to do some swizz, and then it's going to hopefully write out to the console something that doesn't resemble an exception. Okay, ask a question. Why? That would be an ecumenical matter. All right. So now we've built this workflow, we've kind of got this activity. How do we go about debugging this thing? Well, it's actually really easy. The workflow designer allows you to right-click an activity, and you'll see the breakpoint menu. Insert a breakpoint. We run that up. Ask a question. Now, it's stopped on our breakpoint. You'll see actually the locals window is telling us the values of the variables and arguments that are in our workflow. It's actually kind of cool because if you're tracing through a workflow, you can just kind of touch one of those, change it a little bit, and start to simulate how it's going to go through. Really useful. I step over, and I'll see the output from my activity. Okey-doke. And we're done. So, one last thing. Because we're pretty good C# citizens, we write tests for things, don't we? So, using everybody's favorite testing framework, MS Test, let's go and write a unit test for this thing. All right. Wow. I think I've got fat. Activity. I'll drink some water to give the illusion of time passing while it creates that. Okay. Alrighty, so we've got a unit test project. I'm going to delete some of the stuff that we really don't need at the moment. All right. No. So the first thing I'm going to do is test my inputs, right? I actually want to test because I just realized that not supplying a question causes a really nasty problem to happen. Wish I'd planned it that way. I'm going to write a test that says the question is a required argument. So how am I going to execute this thing? How am I going to execute my activity? Well, I can use a workflow invoker the same way as we did before. Invoker. Invoke. You can see how my brain works backwards. All right. So I want to actually say there should be an expected exception in here of an argument exception. So I run this test. It should fail. Now let's make that test pass. So it failed because we got a null reference exception. Yep. How do you make something a required argument? Well, you add the required argument attribute to the argument as you defined in your class. On the designer, you can actually tick a box for this. And then go back and rerun my test. Cool. I'm just going to do one more. So this test is actually just going to check that caps lock, that my response is one of the ones that I expect to be. So you can, for certain, when you're constructing an activity an instance of an activity in code, for certain primitive types, you can just supply the value in here like I'm going to do. Invoker dot invoke activity. Now, one cool thing about the workflow invoker is if you call invoke on an activity of T, it's going to return you that T. So when I call invoke, it's going to return me my string result, right? Because that was the T part that I defined in my class. It gets mapped to the result out argument. The runtime knows about it, the workflow invoker knows about it, so it's just going to send me that thing back, which is kind of handy. Otherwise, you kind of get a dictionary of objects back and you have to index into that dictionary. Good. Okay. I'm just going to say, look, the answers collection should contain the answer that I got back. I'll just give you another view of that. So, yep.
You need to mark it up as a test.
True. Test method. So the answers collection does contain the answer, so it is a valid answer. So what have we seen? We've very quickly seen that we can create a workflow, compose it of our custom activity, we wrote in C#. We debugged it by setting breakpoints in the designer, and then we were able to write some unit tests to test that that activity is actually doing what we expect it to.
Okay. And flick back.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So we've seen how to test and debug a workflow. We've seen that demo. So that's kind of taking us through all the hows. How do I do all these workflow basics? So what else do you need to know? Well, quite a lot, as you can imagine. We've kind of scratched the surface here. So there's a bunch of links here to other sessions that have been given at TechEd in the US, at PDC. There's the .NET Endpoint blog. There's a session that we presented last year introducing WCF and .NET 4. That's available online. And Pete and I also have blogs. So there's a heap of content about workflows in our blogs. You'll be able to pull all these off the slide decks. So we've ticked a bunch of boxes, hopefully. So let's move on to workflow services. And as I say, this is new in Workflow 4. And it's a very powerful new way of authoring services. So what is a service? Workflow service? It is simply a WCF service that is implemented as a workflow. So you no longer have to write a whole bunch of C# code to implement services, especially services that are doing coordination. You can now actually construct those as a workflow, and there's a workflow service host that you give your workflow definition to, and it hosts it for you as a service. So workflow services, what WCF services are all about communication, so we're going to need some activities that allow us to do this communication. So it turns out Microsoft ship us a couple of very useful activities. There's the send activity and the receive activity. And by pairing these activities up, we can implement a whole different bunch of messaging patterns. And we're going to show you how to do that in a second in a demo. But before we get to the demo, we'll just kind of have a look at, well, what would I use a workflow service for? So there's certain types of service logic that you're going to find is actually most easily modeled and programmed as a workflow. So a good example is something like a site that aggregates across a number of service providers. So let's take a car hire, for example. You want to hire a car for 2 weeks from Auckland, return it in Christchurch. So you can create a service mashup to do this quite easily. So you can create a service that takes in those details and then goes across a number of different providers who are exposing a web service. So say you've got Hertz and Avis and a whole bunch of others. And you can call their web service to get a quote from them. And then in your workflow process, you can have a look over the quotes that came back and choose the best quote. And this is also a good example of why you may want to use a workflow, because it's very good at doing asynchronous work. So those calls to the web service can be done asynchronously. All three of them can be dispatched in turn, and then we just sit and wait for the response to come back in. When the response comes back in, we process the results, and we can move on and choose which, whatever the best quote is. So as well as being able to easily model coordination, the workflow service host also has this really nice ability to actually take a running workflow instance and when it's idle, unload it from memory and store it to disk. And when an event comes in that requires that workflow to be woken up and progress, the workflow service host takes care of that for us. And in fact, there's another service that sits alongside this, which is part of that fabric, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, which is responsible for doing some of this wake-up call. So with a workflow service, we have this ability to create services that are very long-running. They can run for days, weeks, months, years. And we, as the author of the workflow, don't actually have to worry about all the plumbing that goes along to make that happen. In Workflow 3, you did. And we actually wrote a service host that did this. And the Microsoft one is much better. Scales out very nicely, recovers well. They've spent a lot of time and effort getting it right, so you can just take advantage of it. Now, one of the things about this is, when I say it scales out well, is you now have these long-running stateful processes that you can put into an application farm, into a web farm. If you're hosting your services in IIS or in WAS, again, this is kind of a precursor to the Fabric talk tomorrow, but you now have the ability to scale out those stateful long-running processes into an app farm because the actual persistent state of the workflow is being pushed into a database. And there's this thing called an instance lock, which makes sure that only one server in the farm is working on that instance at any point in time. I'll drill down more into the detail tomorrow, but suffice to say that you now have a very simple, out-of-the-box way to write long-running, scalable services using the Microsoft platform. So we're just going to jump back into the demos and actually show you how to build and host some workflow services.
All right, so I'm going to try and whiz through this one because it's a little bit long. So this is basically the same setup we had before. All I've done is separated that 8-ball class out into an activity library, so it's in a separate project, so I can use it from my new workflow service project. All right, so let's add that new project. We're going to host this thing as a service. So down in workflow, WCF workflow service, 8-ball service. All right. So this is slightly different. We get a XAML X. XAML X is the extension of the file name there. XAML X just basically means that the activity you're creating, instead of being based off the activity class, is going to be based off a workflow service. So just slightly different. You'll also notice that we have some new issues on here. So we've got a receive request and send response. So what are these things? These are basically the WCF integration points in workflow. This is the cornerstone of doing combining WCF and workflow. Obviously, they map to request and response. So there's a lot. You can go into a lot more detail about what these things do. Essentially, all you need to know is when you define these on a service, on a workflow, and you host that workflow as a service in IIS, the workflow service host is going to basically set up those endpoints for you. So it's going to set up an endpoint for me, which hopefully will probably be called iService1, and it's going to have an operation called getData. All right. So I'm going to change this. I'm going to call it askQuestion. I'm going to say, look, this question takes a well question parameter. Now I need to assign it to something. So I'm going to set up a variable, create a new variable, call a question. Also going to need one for answer. All right. So back in. I'm going to say, look, when this parameter comes in this operation, just assign it into the question variable. And on my response, I'm going to say I've got a response parameter called answer, which is my answer variable. Now it's very easy for me to create this service because all I have to do is drag on my 8-ball activity. I just wire up question to question, result to answer. And now I've got a service that uses my 8-ball activity. All right, so let's just prove that. We've got set this as a startup project. So this should start up the WCF test client. So the WCF test client, just if you haven't seen it before, just allows us to call WCF endpoints. Awesome. Alrighty, so we've created this service. Now, because it's a WCF service, and any class library, any console library, any kind of project you want, you can add a service reference. It's going to give you a proxy, and it's going to allow you, that proxy is going to allow you to call those operations. So kind of nothing special there, but I want to show you what happens when you reference a workflow service, a WCF service in a workflow project. So we're going to add a service reference to our client as our console app. Hit discover. It's going to pick up that workflow service that we created. So you see it has our ask question. I'm going to call it all service. Hit OK. Now, if something comes up here, it says the operation completed successfully. You will see the generated activities in the toolbox when you rebuild the project. What this is telling us is when you reference a WCF service in a workflow project, it creates the activity for you. You don't need to write the code that is an activity that's going to call your service. None of that. It just creates it for you. So once I rebuild, in my toolbox, I should get my asked question. So let's go ahead and just update that client workflow. So open it up. We've got our 8-ball activity. You can get rid of that. We're now service. Thank you very much. Ask the question, bind up answer to answer, and question to the question argument, remember, that we're sending in. I said this is the startup project. We should now see same console app. Please ask a question. I did it right when I prepared this one. Ask why. It'll take a while because it's actually calling a service, and we get the same response that we got before. So now I've hosted that 8-ball activity. I've put it into a workflow service with actually no code. I've referenced it, replaced the old 8-ball activity implementation, and we're up and running. All right. So, but I could have written that activity. I could have written that whole service in like a couple of lines of code in WCF. I mean, that's not really impressive, right?
Well, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, kind of. What I want to show you is a kind of approaching real-world example where we're using manual tasks. We said that workflows are really good at long-running processes, and they do manual tasks very well because typically you could be waiting around for weeks, months, who knows, for that process to come back. The Power of App Fabric and the persistence model in there, it'll save its state to disk, unload itself from memory, and whenever we call this operation, it'll wake up our workflow and continue from where it left off. So this is kind of cool. Let's kind of show you a workflow that does that very quickly. I'm going to show you how you lay that things out in bits and pieces to make it work. So the idea behind this, it's another kind of approval. We start off with a begin approval process. So this is a message that's going to come into our workflow. So this is a service, workflow service. And it actually has 3 arguments. The first one is a list of email addresses. These are the people that we're going to send our message to ask them to agree or disagree with it, basically. So they're going to approve or decline that message. We're going to send an email to each one of these people. We're going to wait for all those responses to come back. We're going to collect them all together, and we're going to call back on your email. We're going to call back the originator and say, look, this is the result of that approval process. All right. So we go through, we have a parallel for each. Now this starts to talk about something, and we talked earlier about how easy it is to do some parallel behavior in a workflow. In this parallel for each, basically what it's saying is for each email in the list of emails, create a parallel branch and do the following for each one. All right. So that's kind of cool. We've just done, spin off 3 threads. Well, no, but we've essentially saying spin up these 3 things and do them together. Okay. Now, catch up with the detail in here. Inside this branch, I essentially have an approver ID that I set up as a new GUID. That's just going to be a unique ID because it's a variable local to that scope, i.e. that single branch. It's going to be unique for each one of those 3 email addresses. Then, I'm going to send an approver email. So this email basically says, please approve or decline the following statement. And there's 2 links. These links marked up approve and decline. These basically go to, you'll see up in the corner I have a .web application, .web project. It's an MVC web application. So when they call those URLs, it will call back our workflow. Because you wanted some kind of UI in there, that's a good reason for start. Also, workflow services don't support REST at the moment. So we couldn't really just do a quick URL and continue. But in the controller for that web project, you'll see that's precisely what we're doing. Calling the client, saying approve. Right. Got a service reference to our workflow service. We call that thing and say push on. As I say, the implementation is not too important here. You can pick up this code from my blog. We get to this point now, after this, and this is kind of how workflow services and long-running services are going to work. This initialized correlation. If you imagine the workflow service host that started up, has hosted these endpoints that I've created, so it's hosted these services, and every time I call one, I'm going to create an instance of my workflow. So how do I know when somebody clicks approve which instance I'm going back to? That happens via correlation. Essentially, you have a token. You tell that token how you can find it. In my case, the approver ID. And then later on, when you have these receiving, when you have these callbacks into these approve and decline methods, you can say, basically correlate on the same thing. And I'll show you that in a second.
Let's run this up.
Yep. So, kind of skimming through it, you've got approve and decline. It's correlated on the same thing, saying approver ID. At the very end, we will implement the approver count and send the result email. Don't have time to go through this in much more detail, but as I say, you can pick up the code. I'll quickly run it.
This is all up on Pete's blog with quite a detailed explanation. So we're kind of running out of time, but if you want to have a look through exactly what's happening, it's all written up for you.
Okay. Go to approve. All right. Decline the next one. And approve the final one. So go through, we'll get to our email. And you have manual task-based workflow implemented simply with a web application, sending some emails, and you've got that kind of process done in basically one workflow that you can customize and you can visualize.
Call it there, I think.
Yep.
Okay, now the other end of this demo that we were going to show you is actually failing that one of the services, and what you would see is a persistence get idled, and we'd be able to resume that when the dependent service came back up again. If you want to see more about that stuff, then come along to the AppFabric session tomorrow, and we'll go through that in more detail. So monitoring, hosting, again, AppFabric tomorrow, we'll talk about more of that in detail. Some extra resources for you. So there's a session we gave on apps last year. There's references there into MSDN and other sessions that have been given. Pull down the slide deck, have a look through. There's plenty of content there. Okay, so that is us. Please submit feedback, and we'll take questions, I think, in the refresh bar. Thanks very much.